consistency in what you're doing that will bring the results. Whether you're perfect, whether you're a little bit under or a little bit over, it probably is going to net balance out if you're consistently pretty good.
Welcome back to the Fuelin podcast. I am Jan Frodeno, and today I have got Scott as my guest. He is the expert, so we do want to hear from him. And we're diving into a space that every athlete, whether pro or amateur, will hit at some point. The off season, the injury zone, or the moments where motivation fades, but your body still needs support. With me, as I said, Scott Tindal, performance nutritionist, co-founder of Fuelin, and one of the few people who actually reads the science that makes it usable for us in the real world. Today, we'll explore how to fuel when you're not chasing a finish line, when you're injured, and when discipline becomes a little too controlling. Let's get into it. Scott, first and foremost, how are you and where do we find you?
G'day, mate. Quite the intro. I love the attention to detail that you apply to these sessions when we do catch up. And honestly, I'm excited and a little bit concerned or terrified about the questions you're going to ask me, and hoping that I have the knowledge to support whatever I'm going to say. But yeah, mate, I'm super interested in this topic, and I know it is a topic that you hold close to your heart, and many athletes. I mean, we just see it over and over again about injuries popping up on social media. Especially stress injuries. So I'm sure we'll touch on that today. Mate, I'm in Sydney in my new house in an area called Manly Vale. Moved just recently, and happy to say it's all working out pretty well.
Well, your new office is looking bright and nice, so hopefully the rest of your house is there to match. The reason I wanted to get into this topic, and before we get into injury, I wanted to more broadly touch. We've just had two of the season highlights. You were over in Germany for Roth. Frankfurt was there, at least for the northern kind of calendar, and I think I know at least of a lot of Aussies that came to visit. There is that weird space in between races, right? Like you've just finished a race. There's no direct goal on the horizon. And the pressure's a little bit off, or at least it should be. And I've had a few times where I have asked myself, do I really need to fuel for this ride? It's just base work. So Scott, let's figure out how you teach your athletes through this kind of in-between period. I know it's not really a downtime as such, but let's get into a little bit into the details. What athletes do in the down and between times. What are the biggest mistakes that you see when there's not an active race on the horizon?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for athletes, especially after a race, to like stay consistent and sort of think about, okay, how much training, well, how much fueling and how much attention do I have to pay to my fueling if I'm going to continue exercising? And I think this is, it was actually, we were talking about it yesterday with an athlete actually who we were doing a sort of client interview with, and he said, like, in the periods of time when he's not training really hard, what he's finding very useful is just using the carb color, the traffic light system, because it means he can stay on top without actually necessarily tracking, but he's aware of like the requirements for what he may need going into the session and then certainly after the session. Because I think, as you say, like there is that sort of moment where you're just like, oh, I can't be bothered tracking hard. And then unintentionally, that could come with the risk that you unintentionally fuel or underfuel correctly for the sessions that you're doing.
Okay, so quickly for those listeners that are not on Fuelin yet or that haven't used it, we do have a traffic light system that basically indicates how many carbs you should be taking per session. Is there an exact grammage that's connected to each one, Scott? You just go into the detail of that, please.
Yeah, well, I think exactly that around exact targets, that's something that we try and get away from with the athletes. Yes, we provide a target for those carb colors, but I think what's really important for athletes to recognize is that tracking has its limitations anyway. Like, it's never going to be perfect. So you're always aiming to be in or around the target. So for a red meal, it's around 30 grams of carbs. for a yellow meal, it's around 50 grams of carbs. And for a green meal, it's around 100 grams of carbs. And that's always a target. Like, I think where athletes go really wrong is they're so hell-bent on hitting 30 grams exactly, or 50 grams exactly, or 100 grams exactly. And it's just an unrealistic target for most athletes to sort of, aspire to hit.
Probably something people underestimate too, right? Because when you're having a gel, and in a gel, technically, like say there's 40 grams of carbs, or there's, I don't know, 25 grams, whatever, it doesn't matter.
25, yeah.
You also, the new ones you get do actually have 40 grams, which is quite a mouthful. I tried one. And you're not getting everything.
Chew on it.
You don't get everything out of the packet either. So technically,
Correct.
There's always something left. And I think, there is kind of a bit of madness and obsession in all of us, which I think comes innately with triathlon. So what in your mind, or what in your view, is the performance cost of underfueling even low intensity sessions? Is that something that's relevant on your radar, or are you like, okay, well, you'll probably make that up throughout the rest of the day?
Look, a low intensity session, I mean, again, it's probably going to depend on the duration. It depends on, how low that intensity is, because there's absolute power and there's relative, there's absolute intensity and relative intensity, isn't there? Your zone 2, you're probably still pushing out like a hell of a lot of watts and a hell of a lot of power, whereas someone else's zone 2 could be very light. Now, we may have a range somewhere between 30 and 60 grams per hour for those lower intensity sessions. For you, you're probably going to opt for around 60 grams, like the higher end of that, because the power output is going to be higher. For someone who's pushing maybe 120 or 130 watts, okay, they're going to hit the lower end of that. And, depending on the duration, they may get away with not fueling that. Now, when I say you may get away, you can get away with it for a while.
I got away with it for like 2 decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is true. You did get away, but it came at a cost, didn't it? I mean, you did have injuries, and, I know there was probably circumstances around those injuries, like getting knocked over and things like that. But, and we've talked at length around, what may have been if maybe the fueling was a little bit better in and around those sessions. And even, I guess the biggest thing is like, how do you feel in those sessions, and how do you feel after those sessions, and how do you recover, on a day-to-day basis, and how do you recover from races? And I think end of the day, like, calories are king. And that's probably the biggest principle that athletes need to remember, is that at the end of the day, your total caloric requirements is really the driving force. Now, you can then obviously break that down into protein, fat, and carbohydrates, but at the end of the day, calories are king.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that is obviously interesting, because we always speak about it. And I spoke to Kyle on the podcast about it, the kind of, in the macro sense, how many grams of carbs are required nowadays on a general training day. Like a normal training day, let's say 5 hours, and you're taking 100 grams of basically sugar an hour. I mean, he was referring to his dentist, and how she's like, we recommend like 30 to 50 grams of sugar or carbs a day, and he was having half a kilo. Maybe just touch on whether you think that just changes at all. Like, instinctively for me, when the intensity drops, I still tend to go to higher fat meals. I love my olive oil, which is calorifically very, very high, and try and complement that with protein. If you look at the protein that is needed, that you recommend at stages, 2 to 2.5 grams per kilo of body weight. I mean, it's massive. And there are some calories in that. Do you recommend any change in composition, or do you just stay with a diet that for any non-exercising person would be probably toxic? Would you describe it that way?
I wouldn't describe it as toxic, but again, like, this is something that we're constantly in conversations with athletes, where they're so focused on the day. So they may have a low intensity session on that day, and they can't understand either why they're not getting why their carbohydrate amount is not necessarily reduced in line with, say, the lower intensity session, because they're not looking at the big picture across the week and what their total caloric requirements are across the week, which, as you said, like they may have a low intensity session on one day, but they're still doing 12, let's say they're doing 12 hours of training across the week. We still have to fill the calorie bucket across the rest of the days. And that means even on a low intensity day, you still may have quite a lot of carbohydrates to actually consume. Now, yes, you could fluctuate the fat, you could fluctuate the protein, but that just gets complicated for athletes in my experience. Like, keep the protein, keep the fat consistent, which we tend to do across the days of the week, because it allows for the athlete to get in a routine around hitting protein amounts, which you described. I mean, it can get difficult.
Yeah.
When you're up to 2.5, even 3 grams per kilo body weight, depending on, if we're trying to keep carbohydrates lower because someone's trying to get into a calorie deficit to lose body fat and lose body weight, then we're still going to keep the protein high. So I think that consistency in protein and fat allows the athlete to sort of manage their protein ingredients within their meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and get in a rhythm with that. And then you're fluctuating the carbohydrates around the training, but also thinking about the big picture of the week. So even on a low intensity session day, you may have quite a lot of carbohydrates to eat around that session. But to your point, in that session, you're not going to be smashing 100 grams of carbs an hour. At most, maybe 60 grams if you're pushing out a lot of power. But a lot of athletes, what we see is they opt for sort of whole foods. And I think, again, to your point, you said you may have opted for some higher fat food. I'm not, you give an example of what you would eat in a lower intensity session. I mean, you didn't eat much, but, what would you have chosen for a zone 2 session?
So for me, there is still a lot of stigma around like body image. Like, if I'm very honest, I train one to keep my sanity, but the other one is just also to stay in shape. And then therefore I will fuel if I'm going out with guys that I know will ride circles around me. If I'm heading out, and that's the thing about living in Andorra, your Tuesday morning bunch has like between 2 and 6 Tour de France riders. So right now, all the guys that are here, they're only here because they're preparing the Vuelta. And it's something where I'm very much aware that I can keep up for an hour, 90 minutes, no problems. But you see the change in everyone's fueling. Like, even the guys going for a long ride, they're just popping carbs like it's going out of fashion. And that is really the time that I will fuel well. But when I go out by myself, there's still very much this kind of thing where I like going out on an empty stomach, that feeling of the fat metabolism kicking in. And it's something that I've obviously trained over years and years, and I enjoy that extra triple layered peanut butter chocolate smoothie when I come home. It's still my reward. And to your point, in the end, you've got a bucket of calories left, and I like to consume them by the bucket rather than keep snacking. It was fascinating because I had a chat to Gordon Ramsay, and he said, he's passionate about Ironman, he's passionate about long distance racing, but his stigma is just grazing all day. He's just so used to tasting things. He wants to try a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that's why he loves Ironman, because he can snack on a gel here and a little bit there and a little bit there. But a carb load for him is impossible. To have a big meal is impossible. And it's not because he's being rude and he's turning down the chef's option. No, it's just he has a little bit here because he wants to try more of that and more of that. So somehow you have to fill your bucket. And for me, that's definitely coming home to a big brekkie off a large session. And, it's so much about feeling good, right? That I kind of know these days, for an easy session, I can get by for a very long time, but I need some sort of extra push, whether that be carbs or caffeine. Actually, if it really gets to a tight spot, even in a session, I'll use caffeine just to survive.
And look, I mean, there's so much to unpack there in that statement. I mean, look, the body image thing is real, yeah. Like, and knowing you for a number of years, like I know there is that element to why you exercise, and I think you're very open about that. Like the vanity is real. I think, look, we all have a bit of vanity in us, and again, talking to some athletes the other day, I mean, we had an athlete who we were just doing some sort of market research or chatting to them about the product, and we asked him why he came on Fuelin, and he said he looked at the finisher photo, and he was like, man, I need to sort this out. Like, I'm an Ironman, but I don't look like an Ironman. And, that's tough because anyone can be an Ironman no matter what you look like. But in his head, he was like, I do all this training, yet I don't look healthy. I don't look fit. And I think there is that balance. And I think it's a really tricky one as a company and as someone who, regards themselves as a nutrition expert. I think the discussion around, health should be part of that. If someone has a fat loss journey, I don't think that's unreasonable, especially if they are carrying more fat than what is deemed healthy. And, in this particular person's case, he was very much like, hey, I know I'm overweight. I do all this training. I don't know how to get it off. He joins Fuelin and he loses, a fairly substantial amount of body fat at the same time, which ultimately has made him healthier. Like when we look through, as he explains, like, from a blood perspective, from a DEXA perspective, and from just a general well-being perspective, losing that body fat has had a positive impact on his life. And I think, that is a real situation that I think a lot of athletes are faced with. And then you have the other side of the spectrum, which is probably those athletes who are already in pretty good shape and maybe need to not lose or think about necessarily losing any more weight. And that's when I think, especially, look, nutrition plays such an important role in both those individuals, in those sort of, personas. And I think, the thing, are you going and doing with those lower intensity sessions where you're not necessarily, you're not pushed by the tour guys? Are you eating before that, or are you going into that session again fasted, or would you just have a coffee sort of going into that session?
Yeah, probably black coffee. Black coffee is my kind of poison. I mean, sometimes I wake up feeling a little bit hungry, a little bit peckish. Then I'll probably have a little snack, maybe, I don't know, like a date filled with peanut butter or something. It's kind of still one of my go-tos. But to be honest, like, on the psychology side of things, like for me, it was very much oftentimes a reversal, so that if I wasn't hitting my numbers yet, I would actually lose weight just to hit the numbers because I thought I could run faster. It would generally be a running thing, which I think the sport has come a lot more healthy because it's now a 360-degree kind of effort. And the swimming performance matters so much that you can't just, fluctuate. It is forever a connected system. And if you look at all the buckets that you kind of got to mix and match, I think the sport is much more developed now to the sense that you don't just have to worry about your run times because, if you're coming off the bike 10 minutes behind or however long behind, then none of that really matters. It really is
Matt
about
Hansen.
Yeah, but Matt Hansen has always been there, and nowadays he's running is still very good, but it's not as extraordinary as it used to be. The overall performance of some of the runners, 2:30, we've seen come close to or get beaten a couple of times now. But in terms of the off season or the in between, I do find it hard to like reframe the purpose of eating well when it's not about race day anymore.
So if you then take that narrative, and I think this is really important. So if we talk about bone health, because bone health is a pretty topical topic at the moment, given some of the recent stress fractures that I saw. Mark Dubrick has just announced he's got a sacral stress fracture. Holly had a sacral stress fracture. Our friend
Lionel yet again.
Lionel has a stress fracture. Okay, I'll give you reasons why you should eat before, during, and after is because protein and carbohydrates are going to have positive effects on bone mineral markers. And you can't see that, you can't feel that, but we know that. And that is like what people have to then sort of say to themselves is, okay, well, I mean, again, there's so many things here. It's like if you do fasted training it may have a positive effect on, say, fat oxidation or the way in which you're utilizing fat as a fuel source at rest, but it most likely won't have any impact on how you utilize fuel during exercise. So that's like big sort of slash against going and doing fasted training in that sense. It's not going to improve your fat oxidation in the training session. The duration of the training over time is what really makes the difference. And whether you ate carbohydrates during your lower intensity sessions or not, because you're going out and doing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of training, that's what makes the difference. And again,
it's also back-to-back sessions, right? Like that, it's not just one. There's multiple sessions in a day usually.
For sure, and that's why you were so good at using fat as a fuel source, because you were training so much, and the volume of training. And I've heard Dan Plews talk about this. We've heard like multiple researchers talk about this, that it is the duration of exercise which seems to be the key component of improving, say, mitochondrial function, and using fat as a fuel source. So I think that for every athlete needs to get that into their head, that it's not about restricting fuel or restricting carbohydrates per se that is going to make you a super fat burner. Okay, it's probably the duration of training that is going to have the biggest effect.
Okay, which brings us to the second block of what I'd like to talk about today. You mentioned the client that you'd just taken on or that you've been speaking to who wanted to change his body composure and felt like he wanted to look more like an athlete. How do we then address it when all those hours and the multiple sessions don't apply anymore in terms of injury? I mean, injury is, like we've just talked about, it is part of walking the line. All the athletes, whether you're professional or not, we're walking a fine line in terms of where we can go with this. And all of a sudden, the caloric need is significantly reduced. And much of what you hold on to of your image of an athlete is, of course, connected to, how you feel and how you are. And myself included, I mean, I really think I'm not moving as much. I don't need to eat as much. Tell me, in your view, Scott, how recovery works, and explain what actually changes in the body during injury and why fueling, in your opinion, is just so critical.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to that, I mean, hopefully you can reduce the risk of injury. And I think the first thing is, whenever you see prevent injuries, I think it's just such a misnomer. Like, you cannot prevent injuries from occurring. And we always, when I was a physiotherapist, working, whether you work in rugby, cricket, Veritas Cup, ice hockey, NHL, whatever, even in Ironman, you can't prevent injuries. They can
humble brag. These are just all the leagues that Scott's worked in. Can I just add that in? Very impressive.
we don't all get to say we're world champion every day, mate. So, back at you. Anyway, look, you can't prevent injuries. You can reduce the risk of them occurring. And I think this is what athletes really have the opportunity to do. And with their coaches, whether that's their training coach, their nutrition coach, their strength and conditioning coach, whatever it is, I think it's that sort of looking at the big picture and going, okay, how can we reduce the risk of this injury? And if we go back to the bone stress injuries, like eating something before, eating potentially something during, if the duration of the session gets over, let's say 70 minutes, and then certainly refueling afterwards. Consuming protein and carbohydrates. There's going to be fat in there, but not focusing on fat. Focusing on your protein intake, focusing on your carbohydrate intake, fat will just tend to look after itself if you're doing that. So I think that's first.
It just tastes so good, though. It just tastes so good. If I imagine that smoothie without like a fat big spoon of peanut butter, it's just not the same.
But
Sorry,
yeah,
anyway,
but,
I know what you
no,
mean.
No,
I know what you mean.
No, but again, coming back to what you said, like your bucket of calories, where you probably saved yourself, Jan, was that you smashed probably 2,000 calories or something like that in that post-session meal. Now, you inadvertently or unconsciously were actually fueling potentially, there or thereabouts to what you needed based on what you'd burnt. A lot of athletes, though, will go into the session fasted. They'll do a fasted session And then afterwards they're like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't eat too much because I've just done all this exercise and I've just burnt all these calories, and that's a good thing because I'm trying to lose weight and I need to be hungry and I need to like potentially starve myself. And then they don't recover properly because they don't give their body the protein, they don't give their body the carbohydrates. And then over time, and it doesn't even have to be that long. I mean, we're talking 48 hours, you see changes in these bone mineral markers where they're going into a catabolic state or the body is breaking down. And that's in the very acute phase. You do that consistently. If women in particular don't cope with low energy availability for a very long period of time, so as short as, say, 7 days, you could start to see negative consequences on the female body.
Yeah.
And that's if you're going into, probably less than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, which again is a very complicated sort of number. And how do we estimate that? You're talking about going into a very low calorie amount.
Yeah.
If you do that as a female, you're not going to cope with it. Men, for whatever reasons, we're a little bit more robust. Physiology, evolution, all those sorts of things are sort of, thrown out there. But at the end of the day, if you don't recover, if you don't supply your body with the necessary calories, and then you don't supply it, if those calories don't actually have the optimal amount of protein and fat and carbohydrates, then you're probably going to run your risk of increasing the risk of an injury occurring.
Okay. So let's dive into that. And what happens metabolically when we're healing? So I know we talked about the prevention, but as you also said, you can't prevent it forever. Something is likely going to go wrong at some stage.
Yep.
We've crossed the line. We're out. Metabolically, what's happening in the body?
It's going up. Yeah, it's going up. I mean, those first... Look, to be exact in terms of, how many hours, you're probably looking at least 72, 3 to 4 days of increased metabolic demand on the body because your body is under stress and it's trying to heal itself. And during that period of time, you certainly don't want to be restricting calories. I think it's really important that you are taking in probably, we are always going to say somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilo body weight of protein, but I would probably be upping that into the 2.5 to 3 grams, the higher end of that amount at that point in time if you're injured. In terms of carbohydrates, you certainly don't want to be restricting them. Now, again, it's always that balance because you're now saying, well, I'm inactive, I'm not doing anything, and the concern for the athlete is they're going to put on weight. I think you've just got to get that out of your head and say, you know what, it's short-term feeding. You're feeding the body or feeding the injury to actually accelerate that recovery process.
And in terms, we're diving into the macros here. Would you say that they're different for different types of injuries, as say bone versus soft tissue? And your bone doesn't need protein. It's just my veggie maths, but
bone 100% needs protein. So the combination of, you think about it, every cell in the body is made from amino acids. So that protein intake is going to be absolutely paramount to the healing of the body. Okay. And so you're certainly looking at keeping your protein intake very high to help with bone recovery, and then helping with the rest of those bone mineral markers are going to be attenuated by carbohydrates. And so you want the combination of both of those to occur. Interestingly, do you remember, I think it was our very first podcast, which, apologies to everyone, the sound quality was terrible because I kept getting told that. But we were talking about I think it was your surgery, and we were talking about carbohydrate loading, and you were like, oh, yeah, that makes complete sense. Like why I didn't do that and so on. Well, actually after that, the Hospital of Maryland's in America, actually, one of their head researchers has reached out and said that they're really interested in the notion of actually putting forward like a randomized controlled study with their fracture clinic, looking at lower limb fractures and doing carbohydrate loading coming into it. So we're hoping, I actually got a call this week with them, and we're going to be finalizing the study protocol, but utilizing 2 carbohydrate products. Hopefully Morton and Precision Hydration are going to be involved in the study, which is pretty unique because it's definitely not a use case of the product that they probably ever thought it would be used for. But we're going to do like a carbohydrate load for a select group. It's going to be completely randomized and look at actually how they respond in terms of accelerated recovery from their surgery, which
That's
I think is
pretty crazy.
awesome.
Popping a gel before you get knocked out from the anesthetics.
Literally.
You just get one more gel.
Yeah. We were actually talking about it. So we were talking about like using the Morton 320 or the Precision, the PF60, and they've got to crank that into them, and then how many gels, and it'd be quite a cool thing. Like, you imagine being a patient, you've had a fracture, and then they give you this sort of, goodies bag of Morton or Precision, and they say you've got to actually consume all this before surgery.
Which
it's
is weird because I was told to fast, so I would have assumed that they would take that in intravenously, but I was told to fast, I don't know, 12, 24 hours beforehand.
Yep. 12 hours is typical. And so, well, this is the whole conversation. So then we're talking to this anaesthetist, the head of anesthesia at the hospital as well, who's on the call. And the gastroenterologists are actually ahead of the curve with this. So what they're now doing is giving carbohydrate feeds when they're doing gut surgery, and what they're seeing is actually improved outcomes in terms of the sutures, and the surgery is actually having a better result. So when this gentleman, Nathan, who's an avid triathlete, he was listening to our podcast, he was like, oh my God, this makes complete sense. Can we do this with the orthopedics? And so now they're like fully into it. And I think it will work really well. And your point about the intravenous, though. So the typical thing is that you fast. And it's like, well, is that just historic because they were actually worried about the gut having something in it and that could cause complications? The head anaesthetist is saying, well, actually, they don't know. And so now what they're challenging is that theory that maybe you don't need to fast, and actually having some fuel on board will accelerate the healing process afterwards. And that's what the whole purpose of the study is. But to your point about the intravenous, it was when I was talking to Alan and Megan, I was sort of asking them, do we have any thoughts or, suggestions with regards to how we do this carbohydrate load? And the first thing Alan said, well, if you can stick an intravenous, line into them and just pump them full of the carbohydrates, like full of dextrose or whatnot, then that could be an easier way to do it as opposed to getting them to consume. So, we're waiting to see which way we go. But I think it will happen, and we'll do it as a small pilot study to see. And then they're pretty keen on rolling it out sort of across the eastern seaboard, across multi-centre study. So, yeah, watch the space.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely fascinating, because I do remember before I went under the knife, you have to go to the anaesthetist. There we go.
It's a hard word.
It is. I'm struggling with the hard words this morning. And I remember her saying to me, don't underestimate this. This is like running a marathon at 4,000 meters of altitude, slightly uphill. That's roughly the toll it takes on your body. And I was like, ooh, that's a lot without, the joy of actually getting to run that circle. But the stress on the body is immense, and yet you're told to do it, on hospital food, which is already not great in most cases. Fascinating. From the carbs, let's go into supplements. Always a hotly debated topic. Let's start with muscle repair, probably inflammation control, some practical supplements that you recommend day in, day out to your athletes when things get sticky.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Kyle. I remember the first thing when we were talking about the non-negotiables in terms of just health and maintenance, and I do recommend creatine monohydrate, and certainly, again, would I be recommending that post-surgery or post-injury? Absolutely, and there seems to be emerging evidence around creatine that it could accelerate some of that muscle recovery. So that would be one thing, but in terms of inflammation, I think looking at your omega-3s, I think it makes complete sense taking fairly high dose, so somewhere in that 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA. I tend to recommend that on a daily basis, to be honest, and I think if someone, I think you're just taking that as a non-negotiable. I think the evidence is fairly clear that those individuals who are taking in omega-3s on a daily basis, and it's that chronic supplementation, are probably going to have better outcomes in terms of cardiovascular risk, cancer risk, neurodegenerative sort of risk. That it's one of those just supplements you should be taking on a daily basis. Should you continue taking that after surgery? 100%.
Okay. Let's just double click on the creatine, because there was an interesting study that it is obviously the most studied supplement. We've talked about it a few times, but that it's actually got effects on brain health. Did you pick up on any of that?
Yeah, I did. It was that the one with the Alzheimer's that they did recently. So I know Patrick Rondo was talking about it, and she got a bit of flack in her post about it because it was a very small study, and the actual outcomes that it did have a statistically and apparently a clinically relevant outcome. It was very small though, and it was a very small number of individuals. So I think, look, the point of it certainly didn't do any harm. It potentially had some positive effects. And I think it's like, okay, let's explore this further before anyone gets too excited about it. And there's been other studies on the benefits around brain. Like, so I saw one the other day, and it was like a big title, like creatine. And then there was another one about omegas, and it improves brain health. And then you actually read the one around omegas, and it was, they gave poor little mice a traumatic brain injury, and then they supplemented them with high dose omegas, and it improved some outcome, but it was mice. So the headline is misleading. It's mice. Okay, it's interesting. There have been some other studies, I believe, with like traumatic brain injury, i.e. concussion, and then taking high-dose creatine or high-dose omegas and then accelerating the recovery period. But it's usually small studies. The outcomes aren't like blown away, sort of like, unless you do this. I think it's more research required at this point in time. But there doesn't seem to be any harm. So I think, like, again, would I do it? Absolutely. Do I recommend it? Absolutely.
And dosage-wise?
Creatine?
Where do you lie on that?
5 grams a day, every day. If you have an injury, then I would bump it up, especially a head injury, I would bump it up to 20 grams a day.
20 grams a day. Wow.
Yep.
That's
and then the other really interesting about creatine, which we've been doing, so with Holly, Fred, and Kyle, we've been doing sort of like a little bit of a, you talk about the post-race period. I know I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but we've been doing sort of this post-race protocol or race protocol. So leading into the race, what are we doing to try and dampen inflammation, like tart cherry juice or tart cherry concentrate, taking that on a regular basis leading into the race for 5 days. You laugh, but it's effective.
I laugh how things come around.
Oh, yeah, you would have seen tart cherry juice ages ago.
Yeah, totally came around. Like bicarb was a thing in the 90s, and then it kind of went away, and now it's becoming a thing. And I remember the British squad I think leading into the 2012 Olympics, like they were all on the juice, and everybody's just, sorry, that sounded really bad. They were all on the cherry juice. I take that back, please. Do not cut this snippet. They were all on the cherry juice and just, washing down, Pepper Joe's and Big Macs with cherry juice.
Yeah. I mean, the cherry juice, there's decent research to show how it can dampen inflammation. And some of those inflammatory markers. So I think using that going into, you're not worried about, reduction in adaptation in the week of the race. Like, you've done your work. So, okay, what can we do to get you into an optimal state going into the race? And then post-race, certainly taking fairly high doses of that of that cherry juice, taking very large doses of carbohydrate immediately after the race. So actually, like, if you ask, like, I remember I was sitting there with Fred, and he was on the couch straight after Roth, and I said, "Mate, have you had your protein? Have you had your creatine? And have you had your carbs?" And he looked at me like, "F off." And then he was like, "Okay, I need to have this." And then I spoke to his wife, and she went and got it, and he sucked down, 50 grams of protein. He sucked down 150 grams of carbs. And there was meant to be, I don't know if he did take, but he was meant to take 20 grams of creatine at that point in time, immediately post-race. Because, again, there is some recent research which shows that high-dose creatine with the protein and carbohydrates accelerates muscle glycogen resynthesis. So it's like, okay, what can we do to accelerate that post-race recovery? Which is in a way an injury. Like it's a hell of a lot of stress on the body and probably causes as much inflammation and markers of damage than as like probably a true muscle strain or something like that.
Gee whiz, long gone are the good old times where you sit down, you have a slice of pizza and a couple of cold beers just to
Well, I will add a caveat. So if you actually look at the plan, so I say, look, within the first 60 minutes, if we can get that 50 to 60 grams, and Holly smashed it after Vancouver. Like, I will give Holly an absolute like credit here. I was like, did you do it? And she's like, of course I did it. And she had 50 grams of protein. She did the 150 grams of carbs, the creatine, did it all. And then if you actually read through, so then at 2 hours, it's like, okay, go to the post recovery. And I actually write in there like a couple of pieces of pizza, a can of Coke and whatnot. Like go in, or I think I even said, like, if you want to have a beer, have a beer. And, you know, I think you've got to be real at that point in time. But as you say, the pizza and Coke, I think it's still calories, it's still carbohydrates. There's a bit of protein there, certainly. You're getting a little bit of fluid in as well. The other thing...
Let's be honest, like there is a limit as to what you actually feel like. And the bigger issue I see is the fact that you have been taking in significant amounts of carbs throughout the race. And there's just no longer the desire. Like, we're going into a bit of a tangent here about...
Yeah, but I think that's real, Jan. Like, I mean, yeah, you've been sucking back all these carbs, but the reality is you're still in a deficit. Given the energy expenditure of most athletes in a race, they're not meeting their actual energy demands. So actually still getting in that carbohydrate immediately post-race is super important in terms of accelerating that recovery.
I'm not saying that it's not relevant, and I'm not saying that it's not scientifically valid. It's just this is what geese must feel like when, you know, they're being prepared for goose liver pate. I mean, it's just like it feels like it just have to shove things down, and it actually becomes a really hard part of the whole process.
No.
Anyways, let's get back to the injury protocol. Supplement focus. One I would be interested to hear about is probably collagen, the role of vitamin C, vitamin D, magnesium.
Yeah. Well, vitamin D, definitely. I think, again, reducing risk of injuries. So, you know, making sure your vitamin D status is assessed probably at least twice a year to make sure you're optimal. I think those individual athletes in the Northern Hemisphere especially are at risk of vitamin D deficiency. I mean, the recent numbers I saw was something like 70% of Americans are vitamin D deficient. Most athletes think they get a lot of sunshine, but actually, and the way in which you create vitamin D in the body is through sun exposure. But if you're doing all your training in the morning, you're probably wearing long sleeves. A lot of athletes wear glasses for whatever reason early in the morning. They've got a hat on and they're covered up. The reality is that even though you're outside, you're not fully exposed to, 75% of your body is not exposed to the sun. And so you're not going to be producing vitamin D even in those summer months. And then if you go into winter months from October, I think it's October to February or October to March, the wavelength of the sun in the Northern Hemisphere during those months isn't actually the right wavelength to produce vitamin D. You then layer on if you're of colour, so if you're black or Hispanic, you have darker pigmentation, you're Indian from the subcontinent, and you're living in the Northern Hemisphere, you're further at risk of vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency. So certainly getting it assessed and addressing that, I can think of an individual that, a female that I did a consultation with the other day, and we went through her bloods, and she was, by far super deficient and from the subcontinent, and had been for a number of years looking at her data, but actually the doctor had never said actually anything about it. So I think it's a relatively simple, it's a simple blood test, and it's a simple solution in terms of supplementing with a vitamin D3 a supplement, and potentially using vitamin K2. You might want to consider using vitamin K2 on top of that, just to accelerate the vitamin D.
Yeah. It is kind of fascinating what's out there, right? And what's being promised, and the supplement market forever bringing out yet more things. and really there's a handful of things that I could think of that actually really work, that actually add to the picture,
Yeah.
even from a
Yeah, I mean,
scientific point of
it's
view.
like you said, though. It's like you said, things come around, don't they? Carbs were big in the 70s and 80s, and whoa, carbs are back on the menu. Protein, I don't know, it probably never was really popular, maybe amongst bodybuilders, and now it's very popular amongst endurance athletes. Cherry juice, bicarb, talk about an injury. I mean, there was a cool study the other day that low-dose bicarb could prevent heat stress injury to the kidneys. All these things that I think have the research, they sort of stick around, don't they? Because they seem to work. You mentioned one thing that is of interest and I think is very topical at the moment is collagen. I mean, it certainly does not appear that collagen is anything magic. I mean, it depends on who you listen to and what research is out there and what you're reading. But, if you listen to someone like Professor Stu Phillips, I mean, he will just absolutely slam collagen peptides and say that there does not appear to be anything really special about them. Certainly in terms of muscle building, they certainly don't seem to be effective at building muscle. And so an individual taking it, certainly from a muscle building perspective, is probably wasting their money.
Really, I always thought, especially for tendons, that was something. I mean, we talked about it as something that I used, being chronically Achilles injury prone or managing an Achilles tendon. I always was told that collagen is the one thing alongside eccentric loading that will strengthen the tendon.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I did and I definitely recommend individuals listen to the episode I did with Dr. Keith Barr, who is he's a researcher at at UC Davis in California, and so his expertise is in tendons, in particular isometric loading, and then the progression into eccentric and concentric loading. And then his opinion is that collagen supplementation with vitamin C certainly has a positive effect. The flip side on that is there's not that much research comparing, say, whey protein supplementation to collagen supplementation and the effect on tendons. And I think what Stu's arguing is that if you actually match them dose for dose, whey protein comes out with similar or superior impact on even the tendons. So it's sort of like, is collagen just something that you could take, or could you continue taking whey protein and it has just as good effect? So,
yeah, I mean, in the end, to even match these kind of requirements of what we spoke about earlier, 2 to 3 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. I mean, in the end, you kind of have to take a protein shake, right? There's not really any way for me to get in 160 to 240. I mean, that's 800 to 2.5 kilos of salmon a day. It is ludicrous every single day. And speaking of shakes, one thing I would like to know, is it as important timing-wise as the carbs? I always thought, like, instinctively you have to take it straight after a training session. I believe that's a myth. Could you just dive into the timing a little bit for listeners?
Yeah, I mean, again, the episode I did with Stu Phillips is a really good one for this, because I think what we're seeing is, we're seeing this evolution of protein research. So previously it was thought, okay, you have to pulse your protein throughout the day in order to maximize sort of, the amino acids, the small building blocks of the protein throughout the body, to maximize the ability for the body to utilize it to grow and to strengthen the body. The reality is that probably now is not the case. And recent research, which showed the difference between consuming 100 grams of protein in one hit versus, say, 20 grams of protein, and the 100 grams of protein had sort of elevated muscle protein synthesis across a very long period of time, and the body was actually able to utilize even in that single massive amount of protein. Now, the caveat to this was it was a milk protein supplement. So again, is that what you want to be taking on a daily basis? Do you really want to be taking 100 grams of protein just from a single source? Because that could run the risk of micronutrition deficiencies or insufficiencies because you're just not eating the protein, which has everything else in it. But it's also very difficult to eat 100 grams of protein. You're going to feel very full and very sluggish in doing that. So you could do it, but practically speaking, do you want to do it? Because you'll probably be laid out on the couch feeling like a whale straight afterwards. And that's not something that everyone, if you've got a day job or you've got a second session in the day, it's probably just not feasible. So splitting up the protein, the total protein amount throughout the day makes complete sense from a practical standpoint. Your question around, do you need to have a protein shake immediately after a session? Depends. I think if you have the ability to eat food after your session, eat the food, as long as it contains the right amount of protein, the right amount of carbohydrates. If it was after a weights training session, maybe you would opt for a shake, maybe, just from a practicality standpoint, because you go, okay, I'm going to get my 40 or 50 grams, depending on your body size, somewhere between 30 and 50 grams of carbs in.
And is it not easier
protein?
Is it not easier for your body to synthesize something that comes in a liquid form?
Well, certainly if you look at whey protein isolate, it's going to be rapidly absorbed by the body. So yes, you will see this rapid spike in amino acids. You'll probably get an insulin response because it is insulinogenic, and that is going to maximize that ability of the body in terms of that muscle protein synthesis. If you did eat the food, probably over that long period of time, it's probably going to net balance out as long as the protein is matched. And I think that's what we don't have is many studies looking at. So all the protein studies used to be like 60 minutes after ingestion of, say, 20 grams of protein. And then they went to 30 grams of protein. Then they went to 40 and 50, and they're like, oh, my God, it still keeps going. If they extend the period of time when they're actually looking at what the body's doing. The problem was that it was always really short windows. Now they're starting, because technology is improving, they're actually able to look at 24 hours after what happens. And so I think what you're going to see is, what we know is it's the total protein intake in the day, that makes the difference. And it's not just one day. And I think this is the other thing where so many athletes get lost in, and certainly what we're seeing Fuelin is they're so focused on that one day. They might go over, they might go under, but it's actually what occurs in the 7 days and then the entire month and then across, 3 months and 6 months. And it's the consistency in what you're doing that will bring the results. Whether you're perfect, whether you're a little bit under or a little bit over, it probably is going to net balance out if you're consistently pretty good.
Which is interesting, right? Because we tend to think in secular sessions, or we tend to think in secular days of where things happen. But if you look at the timing required to build lean muscle mass being 3 weeks, then you look at the time it takes
8 weeks.
8 weeks. Oh, wow.
8 weeks.
There we go. Got my facts off. I thought it was 3. And then if you look at the time required, coming back to the injury topic, for a muscle injury or a tendon injury or a bone injury to heal, we're looking roughly 6 weeks. So the requirement is actually much more a consistency topic than a punctual topic, which we tend to overfocus and give too much value in general to any one session and its specific recovery. I mean, you have to look at it. If you're doing an Ironman, that is a major impact. It is causing a lot of small injuries within your body, and that kind of is just the one to not slow you down all too much. But I think there is a very valid point here in looking at your overall system and not giving too much importance to a single session or even a single blip.
Correct.
Of nutrition and going out.
You miss a meal. Okay, it's not going to have probably a massive impact if the rest of the day is really good. But you don't want to consistently miss a meal or consistently undershoot, because if you're consistently doing that, over time that could accrue to become a big issue. So don't panic if you miss something, but do your best to try and make it up by the end of the day. I think, again, where athletes can make mistakes is they're so low in their intake at the start and they're just missing like the early feeds that it gets to the end of the day and they're looking at it and they're like, oh God, I've got like 120 grams of protein to hit. How am I going to do that? Oh, I can't. Okay. And then that happens a number of days in a row. Okay. Suddenly you're way under on your total protein intake that you should have had for the week. And that could become problematic. Same with your carbohydrates and same even for your fat. You know, if someone is chronically reducing, you know, you talked about fat. Okay. I think the issue with fat is a lot of people like your caloric requirements were fine. You could dump on as much olive oil as you want. I think the mistake that a lot of people make is go, well, it's good for me, isn't it? It's good fats, avocado, almonds, olive oil, but it's still calories. And so if your demands are there, you can probably have as much of that as you want within the constraints of what your total bucket is. But if you're actually trying to lose weight, you're trying to improve body composition, it doesn't matter how good or bad those fats are, they're still going to supply a significant amount of calories to your diet. And so I think that is just really important for athletes to get their head around, and that's where understanding portion size also comes into it.
Yeah.
You mentioned about, but the other thing you mentioned there, you also said about the muscle. So yeah, muscle takes around 8 weeks to actually improve cross-sectional area in the muscle, but you will get immediate strength gains, and that's neuromuscular. So the second time you do your squats on 60, I don't know, what did you squat? 30 kilos or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually, Jan actually had a very good squat. You used to squat like 120 kilos or something.
160 single leg, 100 kilo single.
I wanted to see the video. I always wanted to see the video of what the range of motion was, but it's
no, the range of motion is very specific. So we believe that in cycling and in running, it's the range of motion is minimal. We're talking like, what would it be? 40 degrees 20. Or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
30 to 40 degrees. So you get enough of a burn, but there's still on a single leg, the problem becomes more your core strength than your actual leg strength.
With 160.
Yeah,
it's a lot of load. But you will, you always got that sense, didn't you? You did one session and then you did another session and you feel like, oh, I can do more. I must have got stronger. It's the coordination of the muscles that's actually improving the neuromuscular. But 8 weeks. And, and then you talk about an injury, like someone gets a bone injury. Okay, it might be 6 weeks for healing, but the remodeling of that bone will probably go on for 12 to 18 months. And so,
which is why you can see these kind of things in scans, in subsequent scans, where you can still see traces of the fracture and you're not actually healed.
Yep. And that's where you talk about reducing risk. Like now you've really got to be on point. Things like your micronutrition, so your vitamin D, maybe your calcium intake. And, if you were, like Holly when she was, breastfeeding, that calcium demand is going to be much higher. So for a female who is exercising a lot and wants to reduce the risk of stress fractures, then supplementation with a calcium supplement for maybe the 6 months whilst breastfeeding could be warranted. For a male, it would be probably looking at, okay, just making sure you're getting at least 2,000 milligrams of calcium through food. You mentioned your vitamin D, your protein intake being, consistently in that 2 to 3 grams per kilo, your carbohydrate requirements based on whatever your training volume is, gradually ramping up after that initial period where you've already ramped it up. So, it's the take-home message, I think, around injuries is that it's about consistency. It's about being consistent with your total calories. It's being consistent with your macronutrients, your protein and carbohydrates before, during, and after, based on whatever it is you're doing. And then all the other elements, the things like the vitamin D, the calcium, the omega-3s, the creatine, which are maybe a bit more specific to injuries, they're probably the things that you just need to be aware of and then utilize based on sort of a needs analysis.
Well, my takeaway from that is probably that just because you're not training, it doesn't mean that your metabolism is asleep. It's an overdrive, it's fixing you, and you do need to feed the recovery.
Yeah.
Well, This one was more than just grams and gels, because fueling is about more than just performance. Scott, a massive thanks to you, as always, for breaking things down, calling out the patterns that many of us athletes tend to fall into. It is always easier to see the forest when you're not in it. And if today's episode hit close to home, share it with a training buddy who needs to hear it. We'll catch you next time, hopefully with strong legs, full of glycogen, and all the motivation you need to have a great rest of your season. Till then,
mate.
bye-bye.
Always enjoyable. Cheers, bud. Bye.